Pep? Who is Pep?
When I see that, I'm exhausted. I'm drained. I want to quit.
I will not do forever. That's for sure.
Pep Guardiola will leave Manchester City.
A grown man, one of the most decorated coaches in the history of football, standing in a tunnel, wiping tears from his eyes, while thousands of people who once booed his tactics chanted his name for the last time. That's how it ended.
After 10 years filled with trophies, Pep Guardiola will leave Manchester City.
Pep Guardiola is leaving Manchester City.
It's a genius, maybe sometimes crazy genius. He's made the game more beautiful.
He's cracked the code for football.
Influential, right?
The best manager in the world.
He changed everything.
I think he's changed how the game is understood, how the game should be played.
Not with a trophy lift, not with a title celebration. With a 2-1 defeat, a broken voice, and a decade that simply ran out of road. This is the story of how Pep Guardiola's Manchester City really ended. Not the headline version, the full one.
Pep Guardiola coming to the Premier League was box office.
I've never seen any manager that intense.
There was real excitement around the club when Pep Guardiola first arrived in 2016, just a feeling of possibility, really.
This manager who felt like from a different planet, from a different world.
This was like the cherry on top of the cream, on top of the cake.
Because 10 years, 20 trophies, and one of the most dominant eras any club has ever had don't just end with a press release. They end with doubt, with tears, with a successor who used to be his own assistant, and with a question nobody at that club really wants to answer yet. What happens now that the man who built all of it is finally gone? To understand why his exit hit this hard, you have to understand what he was carrying into that stadium in the first place.
In your life, whatever you're going to do it with passion. I don't want it with players. I will play it with passion.
The greatest innovative managers in history.
He has changed football forever. 100 champions!
In the time he's been here, Guardiola, 4 Premier League titles, 4 EFL Cups, the FA Cup.
Before Manchester City, Guardiola had already built 2 of the most admired teams modern football had ever seen. At Barcelona, he took over a squad built around Lionel Messi and turned it into arguably the greatest club side of its generation. All fluid movement and suffocating possession, winning almost everything the game had to offer within a few short years.
That day, I think, changed the history of football, the history of FC Barcelona, and the history of Messi.
Destroyed Real Madrid in the style that Pep Guardiola wanted.
He was one of the greatest teams ever to play.
And when you win titles, you create belief.
That team was unbelievable. They were playing the best football of the world.
They won absolutely everything. 6 trophies. Nobody had ever done that before.
At Bayern Munich, he walked into a dressing room full of players who'd already won the Champions League without him. And instead of letting that intimidate him, he rebuilt their identity from the ground up, layering in new tactical ideas most of Europe hadn't even considered yet. By the time City came calling in 2016, Guardiola wasn't just a manager. He was a reputation walking through the door, a man whose ideas about football were treated less like tactics and more like philosophy. Go back to that summer and none of what followed was guaranteed. City had money, they had ambition, and they had just hired one of the most talked about coaches in world football. But talked about isn't the same as proven, not in England. Guardiola's football was built on patience and possession, on positional structure so precise it looked more like geometry than sport. Critics said it would never survive the chaos of the Premier League. English football, the story went, was too fast, too physical, too unforgiving for a coach obsessed with passing triangles. City were about to find out if that story was true. His first season gave the doubters plenty of ammunition, no major trophy. A team full of expensive signings still learning to play a completely different way of defending, a way that terrified traditionalists, a goalkeeper expected to play like an outfielder, a backline pushed so high it looked reckless every time it went wrong, fullbacks instructed to tuck inside and play almost like extra midfielders instead of just running up and down the touchline. Pundits lined up to say it plainly. Guardiola's philosophy was beautiful in theory and fragile in practice. Give it a year, they said. The Premier League will break him, the way it's broken plenty of brilliant minds before him. Then came the season that silenced almost all of it. The Centurions. 100 points in a single Premier League campaign. a record nobody had come close to before. City not just winning the title, but obliterating the rest of the division while doing it. That squad didn't just play good football. It redefined what an elite Premier League team was supposed to look like. Patient in build-up, ruthless in the final third, suffocating without the ball. The same tactical ideas that had been mocked as impractical 18 months earlier were suddenly being copied by half the league. Suddenly, the coach who was supposedly too soft for English football had built the most dominant team English football had ever seen. That dominance didn't happen in a vacuum either. Some of City's greatest nights under Guardiola came directly out of a rivalry with Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool. Two completely different footballing philosophies pushing each other to be better year after year. Klopp's high-intensity pressing against Guardiola's patient possession became one of the defining subplots of an entire era of English football. Title races decided by single points, cup ties that felt like heavyweight fights. City didn't just win trophies during this stretch. They won them against a genuine rival operating near the peak of its own powers, which made every one of those titles harder to earn and more meaningful once they were secured. From there, the trophies didn't just come, they piled up. More league titles, FA Cups, League Cups collected almost as an afterthought. City so deep and so well drilled that squad rotation barely dented results. In 2018-19, they won the domestic treble, sweeping every major trophy England had to offer. By any normal measure, this was already one of the greatest managerial spells the sport had seen. Except, there was one trophy that kept slipping through City's fingers, and it was the one that mattered most to the club's owners, and eventually to Guardiola himself. The Champions League became City's obsession and their torment in equal measure. Season after season, they dominate domestically, sweep aside contenders across Europe in the group stages, and then find a way to fall short when it mattered most. The lowest point came in 2021, a final against Chelsea and Porto that City were heavily favored to win. Guardiola made a selection call that surprised almost everyone, leaving out players who'd been central to City's identity all season. Chelsea sat deep, absorbed everything City threw at them, and scored the only goal of the game through Kai Havertz. City's manager, usually so certain in his convictions, admitted afterward that he might have gotten the big decisions wrong on the biggest night of the season. That loss followed him. Every time City fell short in Europe after that, the same question came back around. Could Pep Guardiola actually win the trophy his employers cared about most? Or was there something about his approach that simply didn't translate to one-off knockout football? The answer finally came in 2023, and it arrived with help from a player who changed everything the moment he walked through the door. Erling Haaland joined City that summer and did something almost nobody in Premier League history had ever done, scoring 36 league goals in his very first season, shattering a scoring record that had stood since Alan Shearer and Andy Cole set it decades earlier. 52 goals in all competitions. A ruthless, almost mechanical finisher slotted into a system built on patience, giving Guardiola's football a cutting edge it had sometimes lacked in those European nights that got away. With Haaland leading the line, City didn't just win the Champions League that season. They won everything. Premier League, FA Cup, Champions League. The Continental Treble. One of the hardest achievements in the sport. Completed in the same year, the doubts about Guardiola's European credentials should have been permanently silenced. It was the peak. 20 trophies deep into his City career by that point, there was genuinely nothing left to prove. The kid who was supposedly too idealistic for English football had built a genuine dynasty, and now he'd conquered the one competition that had eluded him. Trophies were never the only measure of what Guardiola built at City either. Look at Rodri, a player who arrived from Atletico Madrid as a promising but unproven midfielder and left City's training ground as arguably the most complete defensive midfielder of his generation. The calm, controlling presence at the base of everything City did. That same foundation carried him to Spain's national team, where he anchored the midfield that won the 2026 World Cup and walked away with the Golden Ball as the tournament's outstanding player. It's easy to measure Guardiola's impact in trophies won at club level. It's harder, but just as important to measure it in the players he quietly rebuilt from the ground up. Players whose influence on the international stage traces directly back to lessons learned on a City training pitch. But even dynasties carry weight most people never see from the outside. Behind all of it, hovering over years of City's success, sat something that had nothing to do with what happened on the pitch. In February 2023, the Premier League charged Manchester City with 115 breaches of financial regulation, allegations stretching back over nearly a decade, covering everything from how the club reported its finances to how it cooperated with the investigation itself. City denied every single charge, and they still do. The hearing ran for months, concluded, and as of today, still hasn't produced a verdict anyone outside a small legal room has actually seen. It's the quiet backdrop that followed Guardiola through some of his greatest nights, a cloud that never fully lifted, an asterisk some rivals were always eager to point to, regardless of what happened with the case itself. Whatever the eventual outcome, it's impossible to tell the full story of this era without acknowledging that it played out under that shadow the entire time. Even before Guardiola made his own decision, the squad that had carried him through the glory years was already quietly changing shape. In the spring of 2025, Kevin De Bruyne, arguably the single most important creative player of the entire era, was told he wouldn't be offered a new contract. 10 years, over 400 appearances, a starring role in the 2023 Champions League triumph, and it ended with a farewell match rather than another trophy. De Bruyne left for Napoli, and City said goodbye to one of the defining players of Guardiola's whole project. It was a reminder, a full year before Guardiola's own exit, that the team that built this era wasn't going to last forever in its current form. Pieces were already being quietly removed from the machine, one at a time. By the 2025-26 season, cracks that had nothing to do with courtrooms or contract decisions started showing on the pitch too. Arsenal, who had spent 3 consecutive seasons finishing as bridesmaids to City and their rivals, finally got it right. Mikel Arteta's side ended a 22-year wait for the Premier League title, clinching it when City themselves stumbled at Bournemouth. For a club that had defined a decade of the division, watching someone else finally break through, after years of near misses that City had partly caused, was its own kind of signal. The empire wasn't collapsing, but it wasn't unbeatable anymore either, and Guardiola, more than anyone, would have felt that shift before the rest of us did. There's an irony in exactly who ended that dominance that's almost too fitting to be an accident. Mikel Arteta didn't arrive at Arsenal from nowhere. He spent 3 years as Guardiola's own assistant at City, from 2016 to 2019, sitting right beside him through the early rebuilding years and into the start of the trophy avalanche, absorbing the same ideas about structure and patience before taking them to Arsenal and building his own version of them. The manager who finally dethroned Pep Guardiola's Manchester City was, in a very real sense, one of his own students. Football has a way of circling back on itself like that, and City's players and staff would have understood exactly what that Arsenal title meant, even if the rest of the football world was slower to connect the dots. That's the context that makes what happened next make sense. But if you actually trace the warning signs, this didn't come out of nowhere. Years before this final decision, Guardiola was already talking openly about exhaustion, worrying aloud about his squad facing burnout while chasing trophies on every front at once. In the brutal stretch of fixtures earlier in 2026, he admitted flatly that his players were tired, that the sheer volume of football City had to play year after year was taking a toll nobody outside the dressing room could really appreciate. Anyone who'd followed his career closely could have seen where this was heading, because it wasn't the first time. Back in 2012, a much younger Guardiola walked away from Barcelona in almost identical circumstances, worn down after 4 intense years at the peak of the game, needing to step back before the job consumed him completely. People who'd written his biography and studied him for years noticed the parallel immediately. This wasn't a manager losing his grip. This was a manager who'd been here before, who recognized the exact feeling of a job starting to cost more than it gives back, and who'd learned the hard way not to ignore that feeling a second time. In May 2026, Guardiola made it official, announcing he'd be stepping away from Manchester City at the end of the season. Not fired, not forced out by results, not pushed by a boardroom losing patience. Asked directly whether his energy levels had driven the decision, he didn't dodge it. "Absolutely," he said. "I felt I could not maintain the same energy under the expectation of fighting for a title every day." After his final match, still raw from the emotion of it all, he put it even more simply. "I am so tired." Not a complaint. Just an honest admission from a man who'd spent a decade refusing to let up, finally allowing himself to say the quiet part out loud. Asked more broadly why now, he didn't reach for a dramatic explanation either. "There is no reason," he said, "but deep inside, I know it's my time." 10 years is a long time to hold together the intensity his football demands, from himself and from everyone around him. "Nothing is eternal," he said. "If it were, he'd still be there." His final game came against Aston Villa. City lost it, 2-1, which, in a way, felt strangely fitting. A reminder that even in his very last act, football refused to hand him a storybook ending. But the scoreline wasn't really the story that day. Before kickoff, Bernardo Silva, one of the players who'd been with Guardiola through almost the entire journey, was already emotional walking out of the tunnel for the last time under him. Guardiola, watching it happen, pulled him in and held him, wiping away his own tears in the process. Later, the club played a tribute video, message after message from supporters thanking him for the decade he'd given them. Cameras caught Guardiola listening to every single one, discreetly wiping his eyes again and again, trying and mostly failing to keep his composure in front of a stadium that had watched him become the most successful manager in the club's history. Asked afterward why he was letting himself be so visibly emotional in front of cameras, in front of a full stadium, Guardiola simply said that emotions exist to be expressed, not hidden. 10 years of intensity finally allowed to surface all at once. Afterward, he tried to describe what the club meant to him, and the words came out simply. He'd carry City in his heart for the rest of his life. Whatever comes next for him professionally, that part isn't really up for debate anymore. The tributes since then have made it permanent in their own way. City are renaming their North Stand the Pep Guardiola Stand. A statue is being commissioned, which will stand outside a stadium he essentially redefined during his time there. He isn't disappearing from the club completely either. He's taking on a role as a global ambassador, offering technical advice across the wider City football group, staying connected to a project he spent a decade building without staying in the seat that actually demands results every single week. And that seat now belongs to someone with a strange, almost poetic connection to everything that came before. In the weeks after Guardiola's announcement, plenty of names were floated as possible successors, experienced coaches from across Europe, each one presented as the next great idea for how to follow an era like this one. But City eventually landed on someone already inside the family. Enzo Maresca, City's new head coach, isn't a stranger walking into an unfamiliar building any more than Guardiola once was walking out of one. Maresca coached City's elite development squad back in 2020, then spent a season as Guardiola's own assistant in 2022 and 2023. Inside the room, inside the meetings, learning directly from the coach he's now been asked to replace. In between, he went and proved himself elsewhere, most recently managing Chelsea before an in-season departure that sent him back to Manchester on a 3-year deal. There's a strange symmetry buried in that path. The man who takes over at City once helped build the very identity he now has to protect, and the club he's leaving behind in London has already moved on to a Real Madrid cast-off of its own in Xabi Alonso. 2 coaching journeys crossing paths in the same summer, for 2 different clubs trying to figure out what comes after their most turbulent seasons in years. Maresca isn't an isolated case either. He's just the latest branch of something much bigger. Vincent Kompany, once City's captain and the emotional heartbeat of Guardiola's early trophy-winning sides, is now managing Bayern Munich, one of the very clubs Guardiola himself once led. Between Kompany at Bayern, Arteta at Arsenal, and now Maresca at City itself, Guardiola's fingerprints are scattered across 3 of European football's biggest jobs, held by people who once stood in a room and listened to him explain exactly how he wanted the game played. That's its own kind of legacy, separate from trophies entirely. Not just what he won, but how many people he changed the way of thinking for, and how many of those people are now shaping the next generation of the sport in his image, or in deliberate reaction against it. Maresca doesn't get a quiet introduction either. His first real test comes almost immediately in the Community Shield against Arsenal, the very team that ended City's grip on the Premier League title, going head-to-head with the new man before the season has even properly started. A week later, the Premier League campaign itself begins at home against Bournemouth, the same opponent whose result last season effectively confirmed City's title had slipped away. It's hard to imagine a tougher pair of opening tests to hand someone stepping into the shoes of the most successful manager the club has ever had. So what actually changes now? On paper, not much. Most of the same players, the same stadium, soon to carry Guardiola's name on its stand, the same ownership, the same ambition, the same expectation of competing for every trophy available. But something intangible is gone, and everyone connected to City knows it, even if nobody quite knows how to explain it yet. For 10 years, this club operated with an almost unteachable certainty at the very top. A manager whose ideas were so specific and so demanding that an entire era of English football was built in reaction to them. Every rival manager who's coached in the Premier League this past decade has, in some way, had to answer the question of how to beat Pep Guardiola's Manchester City. Now they have to answer a different question. How do you beat Manchester City when Pep Guardiola isn't there anymore? It's worth stepping back and putting this in perspective against the managers who came before him. English football has only had a handful of eras this dominant. Alex Ferguson's decades at Manchester United, Arsene Wenger's Arsenal at their peak, and both of those reigns eventually ended the same way every era eventually does, with the game moving past the man who wants to find it. What made Guardiola's exit different is that he left on his own terms, at a moment of his own choosing, not because results forced the decision, but because he recognized something in himself that the rest of us could only guess at. That's rare in football. Most great managerial careers end in decline, in a slow erosion of results until someone else makes the decision for you. Guardiola got out on a season that still ended with genuine, painful emotion rather than relief. Maybe Enzo Maresca finds his own version of the formula that made Guardiola's football so hard to stop. Maybe the players who won everything under Guardiola simply carry the habits forward without him, the identity so deeply embedded after a decade that it survives the man who built it. Or maybe this really is the moment the story shifts. The way Arsenal's breakthrough already suggested it might be shifting before Guardiola even left. Nobody actually knows yet, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes this moment worth paying attention to. What we do know is this: whatever happens to Manchester City from here, good or bad, it will always be measured against what came before. 20 trophies, a 100-point season nobody had ever touched, a continental treble that silenced a decade of doubts about whether this manager could win the competition that mattered most, and an ending that had nothing to do with tactics or trophies at all, just a man in a tunnel, wiping away tears, saying goodbye to the only version of himself English football had ever known.